Hey guys, it's TheFrXion here, Tank12, haven't called me, I don't really care, welcome back to World of Tanks, where today it's the Advent Calendar Day 17, which means it's a new tank, and it is the SOMUA SM, a French Tier 8 premium heavy tank, which kind of goes in the very same direction as the French autoloading heavy tanks go, like the original French autoloading heavies. Before they introduced the AMX M4 lines, where you had these very big hulky tanks, which still are a lot of fun and have armor, which the French autoloading heavies just don't really have. So how much do you have to pay? It's 10,200 gold to buy this vehicle outright from the store. It's quite a hefty price and a price tag that we'll have to talk about at the end of this video. But first, let's take a look at what the vehicle is supposed to do. So you'd think that it's basically an AMX 5100, but as a premium variant, and you would not be wrong completely. It is very similar to the AMX 5100, but there are some very distinct differences. So the gun is the same, the turret is the same, the hull is completely different. The SOMUA SM has armor, the AMX 5100 does not. The SOMUA SM is quite slow, the AMX 5100 in comparison is not. So those are a bit of a change, and they do have an impact on how you play the AMX 5100 and how you play the SOMUA SM. I think it's quite interesting to see because this is one of the best armored French heavy tanks at tier 8. Now, keep in mind, at tier 8 of the auto-loading line. Now, I'm not talking about the AMX M4 MLE because that one would probably be the best armored, but this one for the auto-loading systems is quite well armored, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. So let's take a look at the gun. It's a 100mm gun, and one of the reasons why these French guns are so loved and so hated is because of their gun handling characteristics. They have, this tank has a 5-round auto-loading system. So you have a clip or a magazine that you load with 5 shells or rounds, and you can fire them all off, and it will be like, if you calculate that, 1500 damage that you can deal, on average. If you have all the 300 damage rolls, you could do more damage than that, or you could do less damage than that. A single shot will, in between those shells, you'll have to wait for 2.25 seconds. So that's quite a while until you have all the 5 shots out there. That's something you have to get used to, but still, you can make it work. It's about 11 seconds until you have fired the final shot. Then, obviously, the reload time is 35.03 seconds for an entire clip. That is quite a long time to be out of the game. That means you have to be extremely aware when to reload and when not to reload. And those are things that you have to learn when you're playing auto-loading tanks, and that's why auto-loading tanks are quite difficult to play for newcomers. That's one of the things that I would really keep in mind when you see the SOMUA SM. But let's take a look at the penetration. 232mm of pen is really, really nice at tier 8. That's that's tier 9 level. 300 alpha is decent. Could have been 320, but since it's an auto-loading tank, I think 300 is quite nice. Since it's a 100mm gun, it's not 105, so it is a bit of a smaller caliber. Your APCR shells, they have 263mm of pen, and they have 1,250 meters shell velocity, while the standard AP shells only have 1,000 meter per second shell velocity. The high explosive shells, which I do run 5 of them, one clip, they only have 50mm of penetration, and I think you can most of the time just ignore it completely. Only like if they're, I don't know, like 5 tank destroyers all with no armor, then loading that would probably be like a very good idea, because you would be able to still do a lot of damage with that clip. Now the gun traverse speed on this tank, or turret traverse, is really bad, 27.86. That's something you have to get used to. I don't think it was as bad as on the AMX 5100, but I don't have it in my mind directly because I haven't played that thing in a very long time. You have 10 degrees of gun depression, 15 degrees of gun elevation, which is very nice, especially the 10 degrees of gun depression. The 15 degrees of gun elevation is one of those French things. They just cannot elevate their guns, those poor sods. Your aim time, on the other hand, now I do have a bit of equipment on this vehicle. Now keep in mind, the equipment that I put on here is when before equipment 2.0 existed, so I didn't look into that and I didn't change it at all. The aim time on this vehicle is on base, I think 2.4, which is way better than on the AMX 5100. It used to be, I think, 3 seconds for a fully aimed in reticle on the AMX 5100. So this you can actually work with. The dispersion, on the other hand, yeah, it could have been better. It used to be, I think, 0.4, and now it's 0.38. I think they did buff it a bit for the vehicle, and it's 0.37 now with the vents that I have, and with Brothers in Arms it will go down to maybe 0.36, 0.35. So I think you can work with that, but still it's not the most accurate tank, something you have to keep in mind. Now let's get to the armor. This is where this tank really shines, or it used to shine, or it shines still if you compare it to French autoloading heavy tanks. You have 1,450 hit points, which is okay, I guess. For French heavies, it's probably in the upper area, at tier 8 at least. 140 millimeters frontal hull armor, 90 on the side, 70 on the rear, which is really spectacular that you have 90 millimeters and 70 on the rear on French tanks. They almost never have that kind of amount of armor on the side. Not even the AMX. The AMX has like 55 on the side, so this thing has 90 millimeters of armor on the side. That is quite a step up. So yeah, 35 additional millimeters of armor is quite nice. The upper plate almost has no weak spots, and because of the angling as well, it's very, very tough. The lower plate is really weirdly angled as well, so it makes it quite difficult to pen that as well. It is obviously less armored, but the upper plate is very, very nice, and if you do not have a lot of pen, if you do not have the right angle, you'll be bouncing the upper plate quite often. That's something that a lot of people first had a massive problem with, because the AMX 5100 does not have any armor at the front, and they just started shooting this thing at the front, and they kept on bouncing and bouncing, and it was so weird. The turret, on the other hand, is the same as the AMX 5100. 120 at the front, 60 on the side, 60 on the rear. The issue is with the angling that you have right here, there are sometimes chances that you bounce right off, but the issue is 120 millimeters is not going to be able to allow you to withstand a lot of shots incoming towards your turret, especially when you have that cupola on top, which is very prominent, especially when you see that this turret ring down here is fairly flat and you can hit that from any side. Yeah, that already kind of counts as 60 millimeters armor on the side because it's not the front anymore, and you can really go through the turret quite easily if you know where to shoot. Now sometimes when the tank is turning its turret and it becomes like rounded all of a sudden, you will bounce, so you'll have some very spectacular bounces on the AMX, on the SOMUA SM, sorry, and that will definitely be quite nice, but the turret is way, way less armored than the hull, and that's something you'll notice. This is one of the tanks where they kind of reversed the side scraping, no, not the side scraping, the hull down thing, because the hull is actually more powerful than the turret, and people will just go for the turret immediately, and it's kind of difficult to hide the turret because it's on top of the tank. But still, maybe if the players don't know what they're shooting at, they will be able to, you know, still bounce off your hull instead of the turret, because they always think like, oh, it's an AMX 5100, how hard can it be? All of a sudden they realize it's very, very tough. Now, let's talk about the biggest problem with this tank, or at least the biggest problem that I have with this tank, and the one factor which made the AMX 5100 and the French autoloading heavy line so special for me, and that is the weight and the speed. Now, this tank weighs a whopping 60 tons fully loaded, which is very heavy for a French heavy tank. 700 horsepower that you have on this is severely underpowered for this vehicle. You can see that in the specific power to weight, only 12.39 horsepower per ton. So if you're playing this, maybe go for the turbocharger. If we go into the field modifications as well, we'll have to see if there's a mobility tab, which I would highly suggest going for nowadays. I would definitely take off the vertical stabilizer or the gun laying drive, since the aim time now is okay. So you get that 5 kilometers on top of the 37 that you have, and that makes you 42 kilometers per hour fast. But still, it will take a very long time to gain that speed, because 12.39 horsepower per ton is really not very good. Traverse speed is also lacking 37.8 with crew training and with the events. So yeah, this is what kills the tank for me, unfortunately, because the armor, even though it's quite decent, the turret armor, on the other hand, isn't. And then you have this downside where the mobility is just not cutting it anymore. And you're kind of weirdly a balanced tank that has enough armor for some fights, not enough armor for others. And if players know where to shoot it, if players are only slinging gold, they really do not give a fuck if your tank is angled at all. They'll just start going through with the heat shells. Doesn't really matter. Concealment wise, this tank doesn't have any concealment. It's a huge tank. It's a French heavy. Don't expect anything. And also spotting wise, it only has 380 meters base view range. 370, excuse me. That's even worse. So yeah, this is an old school premium, which they released, I think, 5 years ago. It was very powerful back then because of the armor, and the armor kind of worked because people were not as much shooting gold as they were now, or as they are now. So it's one of those things. I'm not really sure if I would pay 10,200 gold for this vehicle. It's quite a whopping price. Now, if you love French heavy tanks, if you really love the AMX 5100, you will have a bit of a problem with this thing because you think it will be fast. But if you really want to have like the armor and you always want to have a bit of armor on these French autoloading tanks, this might work out for you because having that 5-round magazine is really cool. You know, slapping people around for the 1,500 damage with that pen that you have is a lot of fun. And basically, if you just have like 1 or 2 good clips, you're already at like maybe 2,000 damage, 2,500. So there is fun to be had with this tank, but it's not my kind of vehicle. Now, this is very important. This is my personal opinion. It's not my kind of tank because I like the mobility aspect of the French heavies, and this just doesn't cut it. If I want to have more armor, I much rather go for the AMX M4 MLE 49, which does have the armor and really completely relies on it, even on the turret as well. And it also has the same kind of gun, and the characteristics are kind of identical to one another, right? But it's not an auto-loading system. Now, still, if you are interested in in having a vehicle that resembles the AMX 5100 as closely as possible, but with a little bit of a twist, that being it has armor and is slower, I mean, go right ahead, go for it. But 10,200 gold is quite hefty, it's very expensive. It can work in the hands of a very capable player because you need to know how to utilize the auto-loading system on this gun, on this tank. So yeah, it's not a vehicle for everyone, at least that's what I think. Still, in the end, without any biases speaking, it's not a bad tank. It's just not my vehicle, and I would not buy it, but maybe you would enjoy it. If you enjoy the AMX 5100, you will probably not enjoy it as much. If you like the AMX M4 MLE 49 and you want to have an auto-loading thing on there, you might enjoy it more. So that's kind of my stance. I personally would swerve away and not buy this tank, especially because of that very hefty price tag. And since I think there are better versions for the French vehicles which do better at tier 8 with the AMX M4 MLE 49.